Welcome to Crime Time, Inc. I wonder what Tom and Simon will think about this case. Today we're diving deep into the story of Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman. We're going to untangle the life and crimes of this hitman who claimed over 100 victims. Where do we even begin with someone like this?
What's fascinating is the duality. On the surface, he's a family man from suburban New Jersey. But underneath, he's allegedly carrying out hits for the mob. That's a jarring contrast, and it makes you wonder, how did he maintain that facade for so long?
It's like a real-life Jekyll and Hyde situation.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned his family and neighbors in Dumont had no clue. They described him as a regular guy, maybe a bit temperamental, but nothing that screamed cold-blooded killer. How is that even possible?
It speaks to his compartmentalization, which, if his claims are true, had to be incredibly strong. Think about it. He's living with this immense secret, this dark side, while appearing completely normal. That takes a certain kind of mental separation.
That's terrifying to think about. And then there's the question of the body count. Kuklinski himself claimed to have murdered between 100 and 200 people. But law enforcement has cast doubt on some of that.
Right. There's a lot of debate about how many of his confessions were true and how many might have been embellished to build his reputation. It's possible some were fabricated to add to the Iceman persona.
So, even figuring out the basics of how many people he killed is tricky. But regardless of the exact number, his methods were undeniably brutal. And the sources paint a pretty disturbing picture of his childhood.
His upbringing was horrific, severe abuse from both parents. His father, Stanley, was an alcoholic who beat him constantly, even killed Kuklinski's older brother. And his mother, Anna, though deeply religious, was also abusive. Imagine growing up in that environment.
It's heartbreaking. What's really striking is how that cycle of abuse seems to have continued in Kuklinski's own family.
Exactly. His son, Dwayne, talked about witnessing Kuklinski's violence towards his mother, Barbara. Broken furniture, black eyes. It's a terrible pattern repeating itself. It makes you think about the lasting impact of trauma and how it can ripple through generations.
It's hard to say for sure how much his childhood shaped him, but it seems like a pretty significant factor in his path. And his descent into darkness started early. He committed his first murder at just 14. He beat a boy named Charlie Lane to death.
That's a chilling sign of how early his capacity for violence emerged. He later said he was scared after, but mostly worried about getting caught. He even removed the boy's teeth and fingertips, thinking it would prevent identification.
It's like something out of a horror movie. The level of premeditation, even at that age, is terrifying. And it wasn't a one-time thing. By 18, he'd killed again, this time burning a man alive after a fight in a bar.
You see this escalation in his violence. Each act becomes more brutal. It speaks to a potential desensitization to the act of killing itself. Around this time, he started getting involved with organized crime, initially through the pirated pornography business.
So this is where his life takes a darker turn. He starts working with the Gambino crime family, and his criminal activities become much more organized.
Right. This is where he allegedly goes from petty theft and random acts of violence to becoming a hitman for the mob. But remember, law enforcement has been skeptical about the extent of his mafia involvement.
It's like there are layers of truth and fabrication in everything he said. It makes you wonder if he was trying to boost his image within the criminal underworld.
Exactly. He might have been trying to make himself seem more valuable, more feared. But regardless of how much he exaggerated, he was clearly deeply embedded in a world of violence and crime.
And this is where the nickname Iceman comes in, right?
Yeah.
Because of his method of freezing his victims.
Yes. He learned the technique from an associate, Robert Pronge. The idea was that freezing a body would make it harder for investigators to determine the time of death.
Right.
And for a while, it seems to have worked. It allowed him to evade capture for years.
So it's a combination of brutality and a chilling practicality. He even believed that cyanide poisoning, another one of his preferred methods, would be undetectable and make deaths look like heart attacks. But we know that's not always true.
Right. Cyanide can be detected if you know what to look for. He claimed he talked to a medical examiner who said it would mimic a heart attack, but that's just not accurate. It shows how easily misinformation can spread, even among professionals.
That's a scary thought. So he's luring victims using cyanide, freezing bodies. It's methodical and disturbing. Let's talk about some specific cases. There's George Malaband, a loan shark who Kuklinski shot. He kept the body in a freezer for 2 years.
2 years? That's incredible. Not just the act itself, but the fact that he could keep that secret hidden, maintain a normal life on the surface while concealing something so horrific.
It takes compartmentalization to a whole new level. And then there's Paul Hoffman, a pharmacist beaten to death with a tire iron.
That case was particularly brutal. lured to a secluded location under the guise of a business deal, then brutally killed. His body was never found, which adds another layer of mystery to it all.
It's like a business deal gone wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but in the most twisted way possible. And then there's Gary Smith, an associate of Kuklinski's, who was killed after an argument. His body was stuffed in a 55-gallon drum. This one actually played a big part in his downfall.
Right. That's where things start to unravel for Kuklinski. He was getting careless with disposing of bodies, and his associates, fearing for their own lives, began to cooperate with authorities.
So until that point, he managed to avoid getting caught despite all these crimes. What finally led to his arrest?
Several factors converged. Investigators were connecting him to unsolved murders, and those associates were starting to talk. But the key was an undercover ATF agent named Dominic Provenzano. He posed as a hitman and infiltrated Kuklinski's inner circle.
Provenzano was incredibly brave to take on that assignment. He spent 18 months building trust with Kuklinski and managed to get recordings of him discussing past murders and future plans.
Those recordings were crucial. They provided undeniable proof of his willingness to kill for profit. It was a brilliant piece of undercover work that brought down one of the most notorious hitmen in history.
It's fascinating how one undercover operation can dismantle an entire criminal enterprise. So, Kuklinski was ultimately convicted of 5 murders, although he claimed many more.
And those additional murders are the source of so much debate. He boasted about killing up to 200 people, including famous figures like Jimmy Hoffa, but there's no evidence to back up many of these claims.
It seems like he had a real need to be seen as the ultimate boogeyman.
Exactly. He loved the notoriety, the fear he inspired. It's possible he exaggerated or even made up stories entirely to feed that image. It makes it incredibly difficult to separate fact from fiction.
We're left with this puzzle of a man who was both a brutal killer and a master manipulator. He died in prison in 2006 from an inflammatory disease. His physical reign of terror ended.
His story continues to fascinate and horrify, raising all sorts of questions about the nature of evil and the impact of childhood trauma. It's a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary-seeming people can be capable of monstrous acts.
It's definitely a lot to unpack.
Absolutely. And we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
You know, it's incredible how meticulous Kuklinski was in covering his tracks. We were talking about George Malabon's body being in a freezer for 2 years.
It's mind-boggling. 2 years. How do you even begin to hide something like that?
He even admitted to keeping another body frozen for 2.5 years during those recordings with undercover agent Provenzano. It makes you wonder about the logistics of it all.
Seriously, where was he storing these bodies? And how did he manage the smell? It's not exactly something you can just casually keep in your kitchen freezer.
He claimed to have used industrial-sized freezers, likely kept at a separate location, maybe a warehouse or a storage unit. It makes sense, given his need for secrecy and his double life.
It fits with the whole compartmentalization thing we were talking about. He had to separate his family man persona from his criminal activities. And that probably extended to the physical locations, too.
Absolutely. It's a chilling level of organization and detachment. And it speaks to his methodical nature, which is evident in the variety of weapons and techniques he used.
We've got handguns, shotguns, crossbows, even cyanide. It's like he had a whole arsenal at his disposal. But cyanide seems to have been his go-to. He believed it was completely undetectable, which, as we know, isn't entirely accurate.
Right. Well, cyanide can be difficult to detect if you're not specifically testing for it. It's not foolproof. Forensic science has come a long way. He even claimed to have spoken to a medical examiner who reinforced his belief that it would mimic a heart attack. It just goes to show how even experts can be misled.
That's a disturbing thought, to think that someone in a position of authority could be so wrong about something so crucial. But regardless of its detectability, Kuklinski saw it as a way to make death seem natural.
He would often lure his victims to isolated places with the promise of some kind of business deal. It was a classic bait and switch. He'd prey on their greed or desperation, and then, once he had them alone and vulnerable, he'd strike.
There's a story in the sources about him disguising himself as a gay man to get close to a mobster who was always heavily guarded.
It was a mobster who was basically untouchable except when he was on the disco dance floor. Kuklinski realized that was his only opportunity. He was willing to transform himself, play a role, to get to his target.
It's like something out of a spy thriller. It speaks to his cunning and his willingness to do whatever it took to get the job done, but it also shows a complete lack of empathy for others. He was manipulating people's perceptions and prejudices to carry out his crimes.
It's a disturbing aspect of his personality that's hard to comprehend. But eventually all his schemes and calculated murders came crashing down. His arrest in 1986 was a turning point.
And we have undercover agent Dominic Provenzano to thank for that. To spend 18 months gaining Kuklinski's trust, pretending to be a hitman himself, that takes an incredible amount of skill and courage.
Absolutely. Undercover work is incredibly demanding. You're constantly on edge, playing a role, knowing that one wrong move could have deadly consequences. But Provenzano pulled it off flawlessly.
He managed to get those crucial recordings of Kuklinski talking about his crimes. Those recordings were the key to his conviction.
Provenzano's work exposed the true depths of Kuklinski's depravity. He wasn't just some mythical figure. He was a real man capable of horrific acts.
So we have the arrest, the trial, the conviction for 5 murders. But Kuklinski claimed to have killed many more. He boasted of a much higher body count, even claiming to have killed Jimmy Hoffa and Paul Castellano.
Right. And that's where things get tricky. Law enforcement officials have expressed serious doubt about many of those claims. We have to remember that Kuklinski had a lot to gain from inflating his body count.
He seemed to revel in his notoriety, in being seen as this larger-than-life boogeyman.
Exactly. It's possible he exaggerated his role in certain crimes or even completely fabricated stories to enhance his reputation. He wanted to be the most feared, the most prolific.
So how do we separate truth from fiction? How do we know what to believe?
It's a challenge. And it's part of what makes this case so intriguing. We have to rely on corroborated evidence, eyewitness accounts, and forensic analysis. We have to be critical of his claims and look for inconsistencies.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing and others might be fake.
Exactly. And even with all the investigations and interviews, there are still unanswered questions. There's always going to be a degree of mystery surrounding the Iceman.
It's a glimpse into a dark and dangerous world. A world of organized crime and violence, where the lines between truth and lies can be very blurry.
It's a world that most of us will never experience firsthand, but it's important to be aware of its existence. Kuklinski's story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can take many forms, and that even the most seemingly ordinary people can be capable of terrible things.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder about the motivations behind such cruelty. What drives someone to become a cold-blooded killer? Is it nature, nurture, or some combination of both?
These are questions that psychologists and criminologists have been grappling with for centuries. There's no easy answer.
And perhaps that's what makes Kuklinski's story so compelling. It forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and to acknowledge the potential for evil that exists within us all.
It's a reminder that we can't afford to be naive about the world around us or the people in it.
Kuklinski died in prison back in 2006, but his legacy continues to fascinate and horrify. His story is a stark reminder that even in a world that often seems desensitized to violence, there are still monsters lurking in the shadows, capable of unspeakable acts.
And his case continues to raise important questions about the nature of evil, the impact of childhood trauma, and the allure of power.
It's definitely a story that will stay with you long after you've heard it.
Absolutely. It challenges our perceptions of good and evil and makes us question our own capacity for darkness. It's a deep dive into the human psyche that leaves you with more questions than answers.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure. And I imagine Tom and Simon will have some really insightful thoughts to share about all of this.
I'm looking forward to hearing their perspectives. They always bring a unique and thought-provoking analysis to these complex cases.
I'm sure they'll have a lot to say about Kuklinski's motivations,
Yeah.
his methods, and the lingering questions surrounding his crimes.
It's a case that continues to fascinate and repulse in equal measure. It's a stark reminder that the human capacity for cruelty knows no bounds.
And on that chilling note, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into the Iceman's story.
Kuklinski's story is just full of contradictions, A family man, but also a ruthlessly efficient killer, a man who claimed hundreds of victims, but whose confessions are often unreliable. I'm really curious to hear what Tom and Simon make of it all. One thing that struck me was just the sheer brutality of his crimes. I mean, we're talking about a man who allegedly killed people in a variety of ways with no apparent remorse.
It's chilling. And on top of that, he managed to live this double life for so long, a loving husband and father, while allegedly committing these horrific acts. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
It speaks to a level of compartmentalization that's really disturbing. He was able to separate those two parts of himself, the family man and the killer. And that separation allowed him to function, to maintain a sense of normalcy, while engaging in incredibly dark behavior.
What do you think about Kuklinski's claims of working for the Gambino family? Was he really a made man? Or was he exaggerating his connections to the mob?
That's a great question, and one that's really difficult to answer definitively. There's no doubt that Kuklinski was involved in criminal activity, but the extent of his ties to the mafia are still up for debate. Some of his claims are definitely corroborated by evidence, but others seem to be embellished, perhaps to bolster his reputation or to make himself seem more valuable to potential clients.
It's like he was trying to create a legend around himself. The Iceman, this untouchable hitman. And that myth-making makes it hard to separate fact from fiction.
Exactly. We have to be careful not to take everything he said at face value. We need to look for evidence, corroboration from other sources, and be willing to question his motives.
From a psychological perspective, how do we make sense of someone like Kuklinski, someone who's capable of such violence, seemingly without any remorse?
It's a question that's fascinated psychologists for centuries, and there's no easy answer. In Kuklinski's case, there are a few factors that might have contributed to his behavior. First, his childhood was incredibly traumatic. He was abused by both of his parents, and that kind of early trauma can have a profound impact on development. It can lead to a distorted view of the world, a lack of empathy, and a propensity for violence. Second, Kuklinski seems to have had some psychopathic traits, such as a lack of remorse, a superficial charm, and a manipulative nature. These traits, combined with his traumatic childhood, may have created a perfect storm for the development of his criminal behavior.
So it's a combination of nature and nurture, a predisposition towards violence, exacerbated by a horrific upbringing.
It's likely a complex interplay of many factors, but it's important to remember that even with a traumatic childhood and psychopathic traits, most people don't become killers. Kuklinski's case is extreme, and it's not representative of everyone who experiences similar challenges.
That's a good point. I think it's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism of true crime, but it's crucial to remember that these are real people with complex lives and motivations.
Exactly. We need to approach these cases with nuance and sensitivity. We need to avoid simplistic explanations and recognize that human behavior is often messy and unpredictable.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the life and crimes of Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman. We've explored his brutal methods, his alleged ties to the mob, and the psychological factors that may have contributed to his behavior, but ultimately, Kuklinski's story remains a mystery, a puzzle with missing pieces, and a reminder of the dark side of human nature. That wraps up today's story. Tune in Sunday for Tom and Simon's Expert Insights.